This conference will now be recorded.
I could slow down a little bit, Jeff, so whenever you want to kick off the meeting.
Okay. Well, welcome. Go ahead, then. Welcome, everybody, to the March NMC meeting. I guess we're starting at this point for every couple of months. We have a pretty short agenda today, but we have some really good items on here, and looking forward to it. So, Maya, what do you go around and call people out, or what are we doing again here? I've done so many of these, I've lost track.
Yeah, I think it's the pleasure of the group if we would like to announce everybody. I think it's kind of useful, but what do you think?
I think this group knows each other pretty well.
Okay, then I'm happy to just roll right along.
If you do end up speaking or contributing to the item 5 discussion, just identify yourself. I think we'd be good to go after that.
I'm just going to ask everybody to remember to mute themselves. I'm kind of trying to go through the list real quick. If you're not speaking, though. So the first item on the agenda today is really the main piece of business that we have to get done. And that's, making sure that we all review that annual compliance assessment for last year's water quality results so that we're able to approve it and then submit it to both FDEP and US EPA. So that draft document is linked in the agenda. It is a draft document. It has not been submitted yet. It's up to you guys to review it and then go ahead, and this is an action item for the NMC today to have a consensus approval to submit it to the entities that are listed in the 2 line here. But basically it's pretty standard and consistent with the water quality results that Ed presented at the last NMC meeting back in January. I think the main point to highlight here is that it is if you go through, it is the 3rd year in a row where Old Tampa Bay is not meeting the thresholds, and so that puts us down a certain set of actions where we need to move on to actions for looking at the individual allocations and assessing the assimilative capacity of Old Tampa Bay. So I think that's the main piece of information that I wanted to convey. I hope that you all were able to review the draft document, and if you had any comments or suggested revisions, now's the time to discuss those before this document is finalized and submitted to EPA and FDEP. I will say that DEP staff was able to review the draft, and they did provide some comments to the estuary program via email. And their comments were largely related to some of the lower Tampa Bay remainder segments, the Manatee River, parts of Boca Ciega Bay, and then also portions of McKay Bay and Upper Hillsborough Bay, and encouraging us to report on water quality monitoring for those bay segments. That's not something that we would address for this annual compliance assessment, but it's something to put on everyone's radar for the RA update and for future annual compliance assessments. With that, though, I really would just like to open it up for any comments from the group.
Didn't they all, and I didn't quite follow this comment back from them, so maybe you could expound on it a little more. It looked like they wanted us to maybe either add or move some of our monitoring locations based on the fact they didn't line up. Really is not doable. Maybe they need to change their method. Did I misread what O'Donnell was saying there?
This email came in yesterday, so we're still processing it, and I think it probably warrants a further discussion in the consortium, because what they are asking is a little bit finer scale monitoring for specific segments. And our purview has been looking at these gross base segment trends in terms of compliance, and this is a little bit of a deviation of what they were asking. I think it probably warrants a discussion in the future for the consortium because it is a change from how we've set up the process in the past. I don't know if we could probably send out sort of an update after this meeting of what that email was asking in the consortium, but it was, as Maya mentioned, more in tune of future compliance assessments. So for next year's 2022 report, they were asking for certain monitoring that was deviating from what we've had in our traditional compliance assessment framework. And that I think that warrants additional discussion in the consortium and how we would address that in the future.
Ed, did we get that email as a group?
No, they sent it to Maya and I
Okay.
last. So, like I said, we'll probably synthesize it and send it out to the consortium to digest, and then, like I mentioned, it will warrant a further discussion of the consortium.
Yes, Felicia, the they is FDEP.
So maybe what I'll do, I'll drop the major comments into the chat for you guys to take a look at. I can do that all at once.
Hey, Maya.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, this is probably not related specifically to this particular document, but the comment that DEP made about the minor base segments, just for the benefit of the group, I know you all know this, but one of the priority management actions that we have identified in the Tampa Bay swim plan update is to look at those minor base segments with respect to water quality and perhaps provide that additional information, and that's consistent with what the estuary program has been doing for the major base segments. So, I mean, that's been identified, hasn't been done yet, but that's I just want to throw that out there so everybody was aware that we have recognized that as a potential added benefit.
I think that the question isn't whether the data sources are there for those base segments, it's just how we integrate that into future reasonable assurance assessment reporting. And that would probably have to be mentioned in this reasonable assurance update that we would be heading this direction if there was consensus of the consortium to do this finer scale reporting for some of those base segments.
You're talking about Ed, when you say finer scale, are you referring to this added or adjusted monitoring, or just basically reporting on those other base segments like we do for the major segments?
So the major points that DEP was making primarily center around the remainder of lower Tampa Bay segments. So we've typically assessed compliance of those like Teresita Bay, Manatee River, and southern Boca Ciega Bay. Just looking at the response in lower Tampa Bay. What they're asking for is discrete responses within each of those bay segments, which is a little bit different than the framework that we originally set up in the 2009 compliance assessment. And
to me, Ed, I mean, again, maybe I'm misinterpreting, but it seemed like they were sort of mixing and matching. They're talking about needing refinement of these monitoring locations and potentially expanding them, but they couch that associated with the non-compliance for chlorophyll A, which isn't, as far as I know, anywhere really near where they're suggesting additional monitoring. Maybe I'm just like losing it in translation here or something.
Yeah, I think we probably need to have DEP come in and speak to the consortium and see what the needs are. I think there's constraints in terms of their EPA reporting for those WIBIDs that are included in the reasonable assurance plan for Tampa Bay. So that was the ask that Kevin, I think, proposed to us last night. But we do need some additional clarity of where we can meet in the middle, perhaps, to look at what they might need for those smaller bay segments and how that might fit into our future compliance assessments that make sense for the consortium, as we've been reporting traditionally going back for years now.
Yeah, I agree, Ed, and I also agree with Jeff that after reading what you put in the chat, it does seem like there's some mixing and matching here of items.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying we might not need more in Old Tampa Bay at this point, but I mean, that's the only bay segment where we've been in the red with any kind of regularity for a long time now. And we're talking about McKay Bay and Boca Ciega and Manatee River, the subsequent portion of that email. So I was a little lost on it, but.
Yeah, I think it's important, as Chris mentioned, to recognize that there's other monitoring that's available for those bay segments. So I think that's an important recognition. It's just we have not traditionally used those resources to assess compliance through the reasonable assurance plan. How we make that fit in the future, I think there's probably some middle ground that could be had on both ends. It's just, we formally have to vet that process, and it's going to be a newer process for those minor bay segments than we have done in the past.
Yeah, Ed, and I think you just kind of said something that clicked with me, which is the difference between reporting and incorporating these segments into the RA plan. I think those are two very different things that are going on. Yeah.
So is there any discussion on the memo itself?
My read on the DEP comments, and as Maya mentioned before, this would not affect this compliance assessment report, but it sounds like we need to come to some agreement with them on future assessment reports through the reasonable assurance plan.
Yeah, as long as the comments are specifically for future assessments, I'm okay with the current memo as it is now.
And any other discussion? Oh, Nan?
Hi, this is Nan Bennett with Oldsmar. I'm trying to see if we're saying what specific action we are going to take in Old Tampa Bay, and I'm not picking it up in the memo.
So the next step is to evaluate the similar capacity of Old Tampa Bay. That's the framework flow that we're on.
Evaluate the what, Ed?
So we're assembling all the loading information now through 2021, and that will go into a response to, and ultimately into the reasonable assurance update. But if you go through the flow diagram of where we're at of not meeting chlorophyll targets for now 3 straight years, and we're below the hydrologically normalized load for Old Tampa Bay, technically we should be assessing whether or not the assimilative capacity for Old Tampa Bay needs to be evaluated as a consortium and as a body.
But that wouldn't necessarily be in this memo, Nan.
Yeah, so we referenced that we'll be considering evaluating the assimilative capacity of the Old Tampa Bay segment in the memo. That's the part that I have highlighted here. That's going to take a little bit of time, into the next RA plan and reporting period. Some of the work that Roger's going to present on later in this meeting is sort of like the first step of looking at that and piecing together what the strategy will be. So I think we have been proactive in developing some of this stuff, but it'll take time to truly evaluate the assimilative capacity of that bay segment.
Yeah, and I'm good with the memo too. I mean, if anything, to sort of, you might want to like, firm up that the old Tampa Bay working group was an effort to get out in front of something we sort of saw happening. But it doesn't really change the content of the memo. I think the content of the memo is great. I'm, not great because we're got a base segment problem, but solid. But maybe that's something to let say, hey, we already tried to start, get out in front of this by forming the old Tampa Bay working group, and we sort of saw this coming.
Yeah, so we have that sentence in response. The consortium formed an Old Tampa Bay working group in early 2020 to prioritize additional investigations and future management actions to alleviate the conditions that foster the summertime blooms. Do you have like tweaks to that? Do you think it's not quite strong enough in the proactive part, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, just saying prior to a third failure,
I can do that. Yeah.
That was the only thing I saw. I would probably not even have mentioned it, but
I think Nan's question was a good one, to make sure that the group understands sort of the next steps that we're going to be tackling over the coming years. And so I'm kind of hoping to take the temperature of the room if everyone understands what we mean when we talk about assessing the assimilative capacity of Old Tampa Bay, and they kind of, does everybody have their arms around that? I know there's like a lot of new faces in the group too, so.
Hey, Maya, this is Tom. Kind of a tag-on question to Nan. For me, I'm thinking while we're doing the assessment and while we're forging ahead and reevaluating the assimilative capacity, what are DEP and EPA doing? Are they, I mean, do we just keep piling up um, where we don't meet the targets? Are we piling up some sort of negative credit with the regulatory agencies, or what's happening on the other side of this? They understand we're trying to fix it, but the odds are while we're fixing it, we may not meet our goals again next year. I mean, this year in 2022, we may not meet them again in 2023. So what's happening on that side of the equation?
So if anybody from DEP or EPA would like to weigh in, but my understanding is that's action 5, which kind of falls below the bar of what we do, but essentially that's looking at individual entity compliance with, your permits. And I don't know if there's a plan to do that or not.
when the original flow chart was put together, DEP determined that it wouldn't be appropriate to be explicit about what actions would come if we ended up in this situation. That's why we have a little line and arrows to it. The NMC proposed something, but DEP basically came back and said, we don't want to be boxed in, essentially. Those are my words. I was on that side of the table at the time. Because what happens if we come back in compliance and stay in compliance? Who knows?
It's a new set of questions, so they're good questions. And unfortunately, Tom, that's one that I can't answer. It's one that DEP and EPA has to answer.
Right, and I understand that. I'm just trying to think of, all right, what are all the moving parts doing while we're trying to wrap our hands around what to do about Old Tampa Bay? And to Jeff's point, what if we come back to in compliance? Are then we good, or does that just buy us breathing room until we're here again a year from now? And also the question of what if we go 2, 3, 4, 5 years and we can't stay in compliance? Are we going to try to figure out a new, do we get a new litmus test? Maybe chlorophyll's not part of the equation. I don't know. I'm just speculating, but do we need to reevaluate the evaluation?
And And to that point, well, Charles Kovich and I discussed this at length, basically, which is why there's nothing below that line. Because there's all these myriad of potential scenarios that occur now in the bay segment. That is why there are 4 separate orders here, so that any one could potentially be modified to better address what the science is telling us in either direction, more restrictive or less restrictive. So that was always the premise of this model when Charles and I were trying to put it together.
And Maya, this is Felicia. No one's here from our TMDL department, but from what I remember and recall is that DEP, of course, has the lead on this. But if the program were to actually do the assimilative capacity of Old Tampa Bay and present that information to EPA, the TMDL that EPA has could be modified. So I do know that part the EPA would weigh in on.
Yeah, in all reality, you know, speaking to, I think, some of Jeff's questions and Tom's concerns about the DEP and EPA side, right now, the assimilative capacity for Old Tampa Bay is 486 tons nitrogen per year. We're below that when you consider the hydrologic conditions, and we've been below that for quite some time. But there's a disconnect in terms of the water quality conditions that we're now seeing over the past couple of years. So in my mind, even with the additional DEP and potentially EPA oversight of individual permits, you're not going to see probably folks out of compliance with their 5-year allocations because we're so much below that target loading. The work that we would pursue as an SU program is that reevaluation of the assimilative capacity, and in all likelihood, it would probably mean that a lower total nitrogen load to Old Tampa Bay is now required to maintain adequate water quality. That, in a result, would ratchet down allocations for individuals and entities within that bay segment, and that would take some time to integrate into permit renewals. And at that point, you know, that would be the new sort of assessment benchmark that we report on to the reasonable assurance process. All that's not going to happen fairly quickly because, you know, we still need to assemble the information and probably do some more refined assessments on what the true assimilative capacity for the Old Tampa Bay segment is. And that is, again, a discussion of the consortium of if we want to go down that route. And that is the response that we said that we do as a consortium body in response to not meeting water quality conditions for successive concurrent years. And you know, that's frankly where we're at. It's not good news, I don't think, but it's just sort of the reality of what that expression of nutrients is in the Old Tampa Bay segment as we see it, as we see it today.
And that's also why we've been pushing, you know, the importance and the value of pairing nutrient reductions with these additional management strategies. It's been like the driving force behind the Old Tampa Bay Actionable Science Working Group, is because, you know, we could keep ratcheting nutrient loads down and we still might not see the improvements that we need to see. So like it's should we also add tools so that we can begin to see water quality conditions that are supportive of seagrass growth, which is our goal all along. And so, you know, that's where these conversations have been coming from, because otherwise you're going to have to just keep ratcheting back the nutrient load.
Right, and I would say that, you know, what Ed is talking about is probably for individual NPDES domestic plants is probably a 10-year time frame, legitimately. Particularly for those that are in compliance with their existing load and would be out of the compliance with a proposed load, they're now going to probably be under an AO to meet those new loads, which gives them another 5 years to come up with that corrective action. So by that point, we would all be over the threshold of Senate Bill 64, a reclaimed water bill that requires us to largely eliminate our outfalls, even with the exceptions. So I think to Maya's point, I'm not sure that I actually remain convinced that that's not the main driving force behind the problem here in Old Tampa Bay. I mean, you can see it in the outlay of where we fail. We fail all on the west side primarily, or above the causeway where the land bridges are. But I think what unless there's more discussion regarding the content of the memo, I think what we might be looking for is a motion. Is that what we need here, Maya, for you to move forward?
Yeah, it does need to be an action. People can respond in the affirmative or negative in the chat. That would be helpful. I think the one revision that I heard from Jeff was that we could make sure that it was clear that the Old Tampa Bay Working Group was formed prior to the third failure to meet the threshold.
Yeah, and that's just window dressing. We don't have to do that.
Yeah.
But we need a motion if we're going to move it, and we need to move this forward by June, right? This is when it has to be due by June. So we need a motion. I don't think we're going to meet again before then. Or we'll.
I can make a motion.
I'm sorry, Chris. Go ahead.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Okay. Do we have a second?
Dave Blicksburg, Hillsborough County, second.
Okay. All those in favor of moving the proposed memo forward for submittal to the agencies, signify by saying aye in the chat. Yes. Is that good, Maya? Will that work?
That's perfect.
Just to mention before it gets buried, Gerald brought up a good point about the hydrologic normalization and us being below those loads. He recognizes, and I think I've presented information in the past showing that the total loads don't necessarily mimic the hydrologically normalized trends. So there's definitely what appears to be, especially from non-point sources, an increasing trend in Old Tampa Bay in terms of total loadings into that bay segment. So there's some disconnect there that might need some adjustment in how we assess that bay segment in the future as well. And Gerald, I don't know if you want to elaborate any more on the points you made in the chat.
No, Ed, I just, I seem to recall seeing that pattern in the data, but it's been a year or two since I looked at it. And so I wasn't sure if I was off base or not on that. But yeah, that's kind of the pattern I remember seeing from a while back. And it seems like that's maybe something to look at as part of that, as part of the work you're planning on doing.
I don't see any no's in the chat, so I think
This is Nan from Oldsmar, and I haven't looked at what anybody else's point sources are doing, but I know our point source is really reduced. So I know that that's not the problem coming from Oldsmar. We're a very small contributor, but I think we need to look at, like you said, the non-point sources and possibly either sediment load, in the sediment in the bay, or the other thing to remember is that we're at the top of the bay, and when tidal things push up, it takes a while for it to get back down. And so we're impacted by every other segment south of us as well. It's just very complicated. It's not easy. It's not direct. We've all been working on this a long time. And, we've been frustrated with this particular bay segment, despite all of the progress we've made on what we knew we could take care of. So I just think it's going to be a complicated answer, or we would have already achieved success.
I think that lends to Maya's point is that, the nutrient reductions that have been pursued by this body over the past 30 years have been instrumental to the recovery, but this bay segment has in particular struggled, and that bonus activities or actions are probably needed to bring this bay segment back in line to be supportive of persistent seagrass regrowth and recovery.
All right, well, I think that we have enough ayes to know that the motion carries, and thanks everybody. And now Roger, welcome. And he's gonna tell us something about optical model evaluation.
Thank you very much. So I will start the presentation. Can you see it in my first slide?
Yes.
Great. I'm going to turn my camera off, I think. Okay, so this presentation is a summary of a report I've been working on for the S3 program with the help of Janik Environmental. The primary purpose of the report was to evaluate underwater light conditions in the upper portions of Tampa Bay during the recent decade using a Tampa Bay specific calibrated and verified optical model that Dr. Gallegos. Is the sound okay? Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Okay. I got some echo in here. It was developed by Dr. Gallegos from the Smithsonian Research Center. And the purpose was to examine the recent variations in the underwater light climate that might help explain the substantial setbacks of Tampa Bay seagrasses, most evident in the upper portions since 2016. And the highly detailed and species-specific seagrass information collected by the annual S3 program-sponsored Seagrass Transect program was primarily used in these evaluations. So this is a long list of the agencies and personnel that have made this study possible. The project consisted of 4 primary tasks. The first task was to examine the annual Seagrass Transect information for the 27 transects located in the upper portions of the bay, is shown here as green squares, and then assign that information to the 11 upper bay subsegments, and I included Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay, and Middle Tampa Bay. And the second task was to assemble water quality information, primarily from the 35 EPC stations that I visited monthly, located in this study area, and they are shown as yellow circles, and then assign that information to the respective subsegments. And the next task was to run the optical model using the 3 water quality parameters required for model calculations of light attenuation. And those parameters are chlorophyll A, CDOM, or color dissolved organic matter, and turbidity. And the final task was to combine the Seagrass Transect information from task 1 with the model estimated light attenuation coefficients from task 4 to evaluate potential relationships between the light availability and seagrass condition. Of specific interest was the light availability at the depth of the deepest seagrass meadows, as these meadows would be the most impacted by improved and also by degraded water column light conditions. So a useful approach to summarize the Seagrass Transect information is to calculate the frequency of occurrence of tall seagrass presence as shown in this slide for the 11 selected bay segments. And this approach is possible since the transect sampling follows the strict protocol of sampling predetermined sites along the transects. Further, since the transect measurements include individual seagrass species, these calculations can also be done on a species level, which I will show in the following slides. Now, this slide of total seagrass presence includes annual information for the entire transect program from 1997 to 2020. And the overall pattern is one of improving seagrass presence, but there are large variations in trends among the bay segments. If we focus on the most recent years for the Old Tampa Bay segments, it is clear that seagrass presence has declined substantially in the northern and central west segments. However, large losses are limited to those two segments, while seagrass presence of the other three segments have remained at just above 90% or higher during the most recent years. Further, seagrass presence in the southwest segment increased significantly during the recent decade. The four Hillsborough Bay segments have had an overall decreasing seagrass trend during the recent 3 years. The northwestern segment has a current frequency score of just 8%, and the history of this segment has, since the inception of the program, suggests that the water quality and possible sediment conditions in these sections of Hillsborough Bay near the mouth of the Hillsborough River are marginal for sustained seagrass growth.
Hey, Roger, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
So quick question for the group, or just so that I'm on the right page. When we looked at the report that we just approved for Hillsborough Bay, we are currently meeting the chlorophyll A threshold. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so here's an example of potentially where we're meeting the threshold, but Roger's work would suggest that we're still seeing a light limitation.
Where we're seeing less seagrass, not necessarily light limitation.
But isn't this table saying that, like for the northwest subsegment, you've got 8%.
8% of the transect has seagrass on it.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Thank you. That's what I was getting confused on. All right, cool. Thanks.
Okay. So if you go to the Middle Tampa Bay segment, the northwestern segment has had a significant positive increase in seagrass presence during the recent decade, while the northeastern segment show a substantial loss in 2020.
Hey, Roger, real quick, I'm sorry to
Yep.
be a pain in the ass, but
No
so
problem.
just thinking out loud here for the benefit of the group. So again, looking at this table, then what this would tell me for 2020 for Hillsborough Bay is that we saw a reduction in grass, but because we're meeting chlorophyll, it would suggest that something other than water quality may be at play there, especially for the northwest subsegment. Is that accurate to say that?
Yes, that's accurate.
Those were some of the conclusions you came up with, Roger. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll shut up and I'll wait till you get to the conclusions.
No,
Thanks.
that's okay. That's good. You know, there's no problem asking questions. So the next graph I will show it shows similar information on the individual, but it's using individual seagrass species instead than the total seagrass that I showed in this previous slide. And these graphs will also include attached green macroalgae, Chlorophyll prolifera, when that was present. But first, some general observations. In the northernmost segments of Tampa Bay, Halodula is often the dominant seagrass species, followed by Syringodium and Thalassia. Two additional species are also found, but most often sporadically and with low presence. And those are Rupia and Halophila. Further, the alga Chlorophyll, often considered an invasive species due to its high growth rate and rapid ability to invade large areas of bay bottoms, has occasionally been present primarily in Old Tampa Bay and Hillsborough Bay. And recently, substantial invasions of the alga has occurred in both Old Tampa Bay and Hillsborough Bay. So if we go to what we found for Old Tampa Bay in terms of seagrass species presence, and this is actually total, these graphs include also Chlorophyll. And I will discuss this in general trends, but more detailed information is available in the report, and I would just and it's available to find there. Now, Halodula has been the dominating seagrass species in the upper Old Tampa Bay segments during most of the study period. However, major reductions have occurred for these species during the most recent years, especially in the northern and west central segments. The recent reductions in Halodulu has occurred during years with invasion of Chloropa. It's interesting that despite the large loss of Halodulu in these segments, the total submerged aquatic vegetation, or as I would call it from here on, SAV, that presence has remained near steady and high as a result of the Chloropa invasion. So there shows the Chloropa that showed up in the Old Tampa Bay North and in Old Tampa Bay Central West.
And Roger, that's consistent too with what we've seen with our seagrass maps, that you in Old Tampa Bay, between 18 and 20, you had an almost 1-for-1 switch between seagrass and Chloropa. So yeah, you're right, that SAV total didn't really change much if you include Chloropa in that total.
Yeah, that's interesting, but the two totally different habitats, and we'll discuss a little bit about that later on. The Thalassia and Syringodium have remained near steady or slightly increased in their presence in several segments. Let's see, next one. In Hillsborough Bay, the seagrass diversity has been near totally dominated by Halodulu. However, the alga Chloropa has at times dominated in the two western segments, and substantial reductions of Halodulu have occurred in all segments except the northwest segment, where its presence has been low during the entire study period, which likely is caused by impacts from the Hillsborough River. The on-off presence of Chloropa is clearly evident in the two western segments, and especially in the northwestern segment, where it periodically has ranged within a few years from substantial presence to absence. So a lesson that we learned from Chloropa invasions in Hillsborough Bay during the early days is that the alga creates an unstable habitat due to its rapid growth and equally rapid demise, and it is likely not an assured substitute for a seagrass-dominated habitat. And this slide shows decomposing accumulations of Chloropa near Bayshore Boulevard in Tampa. The seagrass variations in Middle Tampa Bay, these two segments have had quite different seagrass presence. The eastern segment has been dominated by Halodulu and the western segment by Syringodium. The presence of Thalassia has been low and similar in both segments. Halodulu presence in the eastern segment has steadily decreased during the study period and is currently near half of what it was in 2010. On the other hand, there's been a near steady increase, although minor, of Syringodium and Thalassia in this segment. However, the presence of both species decreased somewhat between 2019 and 2020. In contrast, Syringodium increased slightly in the western segment during that period. So this slide and the following two shows the depth distribution of the seagrass species and Chloropa in the 11 base segments based on the transect information. And this information has been restricted to observed SAV abundance of brown blockade scores 2 through 5, which represent the range of abundance from 5% to 100%. A score of 2 or greater is assumed to represent a substantial and likely functional SAV presence. And the discussions of these graphs would be general and focus on major depth changes of the deepest meadows. A more detailed discussion of these graphs is also provided in the report. In Old Tampa Bay, all segments except the southeast segment show a distinct shallowing of the deepest halidulum meadows during the most recent years. This is not apparent for the other species present. Further, the recent shallowing of the deep halidulum in the northern and central west segments has occurred concurrent with substantial colonization of Chlorpa. In Hillsborough Bay, all segments except the northwest segment show the distinct shallowing of the deepest halidulum areas during the most recent years. No other seagrass species was present at the criteria used. Further, the northeast segment was not sampled in 2010 and the northwest segment not in 2018. Also, all segments except the southeast segment had chlorpas were found at deep depths. Oh, yeah, in those two east segments, chlorpa meadows were found at deeper depths than the halidula.
And Roger,
Yeah.
so on the Chlorpa plots where there's no data, that just does that mean there was no Chlorpa, or it wasn't sampled?
It was sampled, but these are brown black clay 2 and greater, so there could be a chlorpa that had less coverage than that criteria.
Okay.
The two middle Tampa Bay segments have had quite different seagrass depth distribution. Halidul has shallowed substantially in the northeast segment, while it has deepened substantially in the northwest segment. Further, Syringodium and Thalassia grow at much deeper depths in the northwest segment than in the northeast segment. So the next step of the task were to run the optical model. And for that, the monthly water quality information was assembled primarily from the selected EPC stations with the 3 parameters that are used as optical model input variables. That's chlorophyll A, turbidity, and CDOM. And this task was relatively straightforward due to the excellent database provided by the EPC. However, a laboratory-related problem that had affected turbidity measurements during 2016 and for the first 2 months of 2017 precluded the use of all turbidity values during that period. Instead, Pinellas County turbidity values were used for the northern and western segments of Old Tampa Bay and the western segment of Middle Tampa Bay during this specific period. So model calculations during that period were not done for the other 7 segments. Also, due to COVID impacts, EPC discontinued CDOM collections in the early 2020. Thus, optical model calculation for that major portion, of 2020 could not be done. The model required water quality parameters and the calculated light attenuation were examined on a monthly basis for the entire study period, except as stated above. However, Ed requested that the optical model work would focus on 2 distinct periods of Tampa Bay seagrass development during the 2010-2020 study period. And these periods were an early period, 2014 through 2016. There was a period with increase in seagrass coverage as observed by SwiftMud, and the period when the Tampa Bay seagrass target was reached and exceeded. And then a second period, the recent period, was between 2017 and 2019, and this period was characterized by mostly decrease in seagrass coverage. So the rest of this presentation will focus on those 2 periods, but the complete study period information is available in the report. So first I will show variations of the three optically important water quality parameters by the 2 periods and by each of the 11 segments. And this slide shows the variations of CDOM concentrations. T-test analysis indicated no statistical difference between the period for any of the old Tampa Bay segments. However, the Hillsborough Bay and Middle Tampa Bay segment all had higher CDOM concentrations during the recent period. And this language differs somewhat from the that I wrote in the draft report, and I will update this information in the final report. Now, this slide shows the variations of chlorophyll concentrations between the 2 periods. And t-test indicated no statistical difference between the 2 periods for any segment. And this slide shows the variation of turbidity measurement as an NTU. And t-test indicated no statistical difference between the 2 periods for any segment except the Central East Old Tampa Bay segment, which had a significantly higher mean value during the recent period. And this also differs somewhat from the language in the draft report, and it will be updated. So these are the results from the calculated optical model evaluations. And using the three water quality parameters as input variables for these calculations of attenuation coefficients. The comparison of the 2 periods indicates a lack of statistical difference, 2 sample t-tests for all segments except for the Central East Old Tampa Bay segment. In this segment, light attenuation was significantly higher during the recent period, apparently as a result of elevated turbidity values during that period. Now this slide shows the depth variations of the deepest seagrass meadows during the 2 periods. T-tests indicate a lack of statistical difference between the 2 periods for all segments, except the northeastern Hillsborough Bay segment, which had a significantly higher mean value during the early period, and the northwestern Middle Tampa Bay segment with a significantly higher mean value during the recent period. The northwest Hillsborough Bay segment did not have sufficient observations for statistical analysis. And further, as discussed earlier, the northwest Hillsborough segment and the Central East Old Tampa Bay segments were excluded from these, will be excluded in the following discussions since the seagrass present in these segments may not be primarily affected by the water column light climate. So in the conclusion section of the draft report, I provided a list of suggested improvements to the ST program adopted attenuation coefficients that may be necessary to establish sustainable seagrass presence at the identified segments target depths. However, after further consideration, ended up using a more direct approach to evaluate those needed improvements, and that would be to focus on primarily the earlier period deepest seagrass depth and how those depths relate to the adopted segment target depths. By definition, if those target depths are achieved, at least the original goal of the program, the original goal of the estuary seagrass acres goal would be to achieve, it would be achieved in the study area examined. And I will also include this discussion to the report.
Roger,
So
I'm sorry, Roger, is this graph based on all the available data for the period of record, or is this just that recent 17 to 19 period?
This is for the early period. 2014 to 2016. That's when we had the, in terms of seagrasses, the best conditions.
Okay.
Yeah. And this slide compares 3 sets of light attenuation coefficients for each of the 11 subsegments. The red symbols show the light attenuation coefficients currently used by the estuary program as target levels for the underwater light penetration. And the blue symbols are model calculated average attenuation coefficients determined in this study. And all are from the early period for the north, except for the northwest middle Tampa Bay segment. That segment had deeper meadows during the recent period. So yeah, and to your question, Chris, that's what this graph shows. The middle Tampa Bay west segment was used for the recent period.
And so what's the difference between the red dot and the green dot? I'm not sure I understand what the green dot is.
The green dot are the actual, those are the measured attenuation coefficients during that period.
Okay, so
red dots are the Tampa Bay estuary program target light penetration values.
okay. So it looks like the model for Hillsborough Bay underpredicted the KD relative to the observed. So your observed was around 1.2, but your model was somewhere between 0.7 and 0.9. Am I reading that correct?
No, let me go through this, perhaps I'll be clear. That will be fine. Yeah, so the blue symbols are the model calculated attenuation coefficients. And the green symbols show the calculated attenuation coefficient required to achieve seagrass presence at the estuary program identified segment target depths. So the red symbols indicate that all program selected light penetration targets allow for higher light attenuation than that measured during this study, and also higher attenuation than required to achieve seagrass presence at the specific target depths. So if we compare the green and blue attenuation coefficients, that indicate that for the segments where the green symbols show higher levels of attenuation than the blue model estimated values, the model estimated light attenuation was sufficient to support seagrass growth at the selected target depths. For the 3 old Tampa Bay segments, where the blue symbols are above the green symbols, the model estimated attenuation is not sufficient to support seagrass at the 2-meter target depth. In those 3 segments, water quality would need improvement over what is present during the early 2014-2016 period. And specifically, Old Tampa Bay North segment would need a quite substantial improvement of near 0.25 KD units. The north, and as I mentioned earlier, the Hillsborough Bay Northwest segment and the Old Tampa Bay East segment were not included in these comparisons due to their weak association with light availability, as I discussed earlier. Was that clear?
I think so, yeah. So the what you said about the Old Tampa Bay segments where the blue dots are greater than the green dots, and these are data from the earlier period, so that would suggest even in the best of times, you weren't meeting your target KD.
Correct.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
However, the findings of the light climate conditions discussed in the previous slide will be evaluated in view of additional findings of this study, which indicate that variations in depth of the deepest seagrass meadows are not strongly reflected in levels of light attenuation in nearly half of the segments examined. So these findings suggest that other growth factors in addition to light availability likely are of importance and affect the deep seagrass distribution in the northern sections of Tampa Bay. So in conclusion, then, the recent substantial losses of seagrass in Tampa Bay have in most areas examined almost entirely consisted of lost Halodula variety. The reasons for this selective loss are not understood. However, the species has a relatively low biomass structure and may be impacted more rapidly by negative growth conditions than the more robust species. The lack of or weak association between variations in depth of the deepest seagrass meadows and light attenuation were found in nearly half of the sub-base segments examined. This indicates that growth factors, in addition to the local underwater light climate, may also affect the seagrass depth distribution in northern sections of the bay. Further, substantial recent region-wide losses of seagrass coverage have also been reported by SwiftMud to have occurred in all three major estuaries of the central west coast of Florida. Also, large recent losses of primarily Halodula variety have been reported from the Indian River Lagoon as well. So these findings indicate that potential complex processes may affect the health of the seagrass community on a local and regional scale, likely in combination with those relating to water quality and the underwater light climate. And a better understanding of those processes would be valuable and should aim towards insight of climatic impacts on seagrass growth. Specific focus should be placed on negative growth conditions caused by increasing water temperatures. Severe impacts on seagrass and other biota by recent estuarine and coastal warming is ever more reported on in the scientific literature. And as a final slide, I would like to show this one, which shows the temperature, monthly temperature distribution in the study area. And we can see there were both in 2018 and 2019, there were prolonged periods of very warm water in the bay. So that could be an indication of temperature impacts. So since this information is from the EPC measured station, this information is mostly for deep areas of the bay, and it's likely that more shallow areas where seagrasses are found would experience more extreme variations of both high and low temperatures. Short and long-term measurements of shallow water temperatures would be perhaps a useful and relatively straightforward study project. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. It's a great presentation. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Hey, Roger, this is Chris. Yeah, thanks a lot. This is really cool stuff. I'm very much, I really want to delve deep into what you were presenting. I think though, you know, for the group, one thing that really stands out, and I think this is kind of confirms what many of us are observing in the field, not only in Tampa Bay, but in other estuaries too, is that, you know, while light is still a significant factor, I think you hit on a couple of really important points. One is that there are other factors that are that are at play here. Temperature, I agree with you, is probably one that's often overlooked, but is very important. And that last slide you showed, I think, tells a very interesting story, and that is what we're seeing too when we look at the air temperature data from Tampa Airport from 1970 to the present, is that if you look at the months of October, especially, when I was just kind of looking through all those panels that you had, but what stands out, if you look at 18 and 19, you know, look at October, especially in 2018, and then compare that with some of the other Octobers. What that suggests, and again, this is kind of confirmed with what I've seen in the air temperature data, which is that those drops in temperature that used to occur in that late fall period aren't happening anymore. It's staying warmer longer, and so that growing season is potentially extending further into what would have been a more dormant period. And the same effect, I think, is happening on the other end in March, where things are warming up more rapidly. And so effectively, you might be extending that growing period. That has implications, I think, not only for seagrass, but also for looking at the persistence of these pyridinium blooms, that perhaps the fact that the temperature is warmer gives these algal species that are arguably more competitive than seagrass an opportunity to dominate. And that was the other point that I think that I took away from this, is that it may not be a light issue necessarily. What it may be is a competition issue. So what we were talking about earlier in Old Tampa Bay, we saw this explosion of Chlorpa, but it doesn't appear that there's a direct causality to that, but perhaps what it is it's simply competition, that Chlorpa can outgrow seagrass. And if there is available nutrients in the water column, that Chlorpa is going to take it, because it takes most of its nutrients from the water column, where seagrass take their nutrients from the sediment. So, and those nutrients, if they're assimilated by Chlorpa, you may not see that in the water quality data. So your water quality data may suggest that, you know, you're meeting your TN target, things are great, but it may be because, and this goes back to we were talking about assimilative capacity. It could be that nitrogen is being assimilated by the Chlorpa. It's outcompeting the haliduli, and therefore you get this shift from seagrass dominated to Chlorpa dominated. Has nothing to do with light. So anyway, really good stuff. I think you know, we could probably talk about this all day, but yeah, this is great. Thank you, Roger.
Yeah.
Appreciate the presentation.
Sure. Yeah. Just to bring up one point, the warmer temperatures can make it much more difficult for seagrasses to compete with other algae, because they're probably more affected by anoxia and hydrogen sulfide and all those things.
Any other questions for Roger?
Just real quick, is this report available?
Yes, it's linked in the meeting materials.
Okay,
It's
awesome.
It's like a draft final report. I know we had a couple of minor comments for Roger to address, but it's there.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, I will also update some of the information that I presented in the draft report.
This is Nan Bennett. I just wanted to say that you noted a similarity between things you saw here and Indian River. Was there a note in the report regarding that?
Might not have been.
Okay.
I think I added that.
I thought it was about the speciation or something.
Yeah, I talked to Chuck, who runs the.
Jacoby.
Yes, yeah. And so I kind of got more familiar with what's going on over there.
Okay. I was just wondering if the input of man-made freshwater in both locations had any play in it, with, you know, the discharge from Lake Okeechobee and Indian River, and then the discharge from Lake Tarpon in this water bay.
I didn't really look at anything like that.
Okay.
I think
Yeah,
they've generally pointed to long residence times in
Yeah.
those lagoon systems.
Yeah, IRL is a it's hard to look at IRL and think it's not about hydraulic residence time. I mean, you could take everything out of that based on what you have already in place, and they make our residence times in Old Tampa Bay look like minutes versus years, basically. So
Roger, I have a sort of a pointed question based on primarily that Katy graph where you had the blue, green, and red points.
Okay.
Particularly in the upper bay segments of Old Tampa Bay. If we were to improve the light environment, I think, you know, in your draft report, I think the estimates were anywhere from like 25 to 30% increases in water quality conditions to support more light to the bay bottom.
Well, that is to support the S3 program's target.
Right.
It's not what we had in 2014 and 2016.
So even if we started to improve water quality to that degree, will we still have issues with persistent seagrass beds for all the other reasons that, you know, Chris was kind of talking about and what you sort of ended on your conclusions in terms of water quality factors other than light availability? I mean, what's your opinion on that as a seagrass biologist?
Well, it would, if we improved water quality, it would make it easier for seagrasses to survive. So it's not just one thing versus another thing. It's interrelationships between seagrass growth and sediments, not just chlorophyll and water quality.
So given the challenges in that upper Old Tampa Bay segment, it seems realistic to ask the community that we need to improve water quality substantially more than perhaps we have in the past to make sure seagrasses have a chance to thrive in that upper bay segment. Is that?
Well, I
the
think
conclusions I'm coming up with.
I would say if we improve water quality to the blue dots there for Old Tampa Bay, Central West might be a possibility, but Old Tampa Bay North is a pretty far below that blue dot. So I don't know if that's practical to expect improvements like that.
I think like these are some of the questions and discussions that are also coming up in the Resilience Coalition meetings, which I don't know how many of you participate in those as well as the NMC discussions, but you know, there's this, they're putting together a regional resilience action plan. And so they're looking at the goals that we've set for ourselves as a region for a variety of things. And seagrass is one of them, the things that they're looking at. And then the question is like, in the face of a changing climate, so different temperature, rainfall regimes, all these things, what do we need to do to ensure that our seagrass resources stay healthy and at the levels that we've established for ourselves? And so I think then it's like this question of what are the levers that we have access to you know, to meet those goals. And you know, they're not, certainly like the folks that are participating in some of those conversations aren't as familiar with everything that the Nitrogen Management Consortium has done. And like, I guess like that's part of like what I'm trying to bridge here is, you know, do we just keep ratcheting back the nutrient loads like Ed is talking about, or are we like as a region going to start to thread together different ways that we can make the bay support the amount of seagrass that we know we want here in the region? So I've said it in that group, but not in this setting the same way. So I'm just trying to like be consistent.
Maya, could you send us or can you send me a link or something to that group? Because I don't know if I've gotten any emails about that group. That sounds like a really interesting group to be a part of.
Yeah, it's convened by the Regional Planning Council, and I'll put a link in
Okay.
that.
Okay, thank you.
But they could definitely use more science minds in the room. They have a lot of sustainability folks, but there's not a lot of cross-pollination. There's some, I know some of you have participated in it, but you know, we would do well participate there too.
Yeah, Maya, I think that what you just said is really at the heart of the conversation that we need to have, and maybe we can, we can talk more about this in the Old Tampa Bay Working Group. But it's a really tough question to answer. If you continue to reduce your nutrient loads, is that going to get you, is that basically, is that paradigm still viable for Old Tampa Bay and perhaps even Hillsborough Bay? And I don't think we have an answer to that today, but I think we're getting some really good discussion on trying to tackle that problem.
So Roger, your temperature, I didn't see your temperature graphs in the paper. They were all pretty much about Old Tampa Bay. Was that true?
Yeah.
Did we see the same? Did you look at other bay segments, and did you see that same fall staying power for those temperatures? Did they remain elevated in October, as Chris pointed out, or did they fall off and follow that more traditional trend? I mean, I know we're seeing increased temperatures across everywhere.
Yeah.
But it'd be interesting to know if the lack of that deep incised channel through the other three bay segments is contributing to maybe helping renormalize those temperatures to keep those temperatures down a little bit more, or if and we're still seeing those increased temperatures stay up there well into fall, be a function of the hydraulic limitations that Old Tampa Bay has.
Yeah, well, this graph that I had there shows, that's a whole, both Old Tampa Bay and Hillsborough Bay and Middle Tampa Bay. So that'd be easy task to separate those out and see what's going on.
Right. Really, really cool stuff, Roger. If there aren't any more questions, we'll let Ray give us a preliminary update on the action plan database.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Maya, do I have control of the board?
Yes, you do.
All right, so y'all can see on slide here.
Yes.
Okay, this is just a real quick. I know we harp on this all the time for those of you who are relatively new, that we want your action plans in our database. By the time we get to putting together the RA for this last 5-year period, we'll want to have a complete listing of nutrient load reduction projects that have been completed for this time period and are planned. This is kind of a little background on the action plan database for those who aren't familiar with it. It not only serves to provide us with projects that result in nitrogen load reductions and other nutrient load reductions, but also practices habitat protection and restoration. And each consortium participant has the ability to get into the action plan database and add and revise projects. And that allows us to put together, when we put together our RA plans, and show DEP what we're doing to reduce and preclude loadings. So at the moment, what's in the database right now, we did a real quick preliminary run through to see what we've got in the can so far for the 2017-2021 RA period. And we're looking at 138 tons per year nitrogen load reduction. As a point of comparison, the last RA period through the 12 through 16, we ended up with 147 tons per year TN load reduction, so it's actually pretty reasonable. But I would suspect that there are still some load reduction projects out there that aren't accounted for, and I'm sure there are some that are currently in the database that I need to get with folks and clarify exactly what these programs are for. At the moment, we've got nitrogen load reduction projects from this list here at the bottom of the page. There may well be others out there, but for these folks at least, I will be contacting you over the next couple of months to make sure I've got all your information and to make sure the information that we currently have in there is accurate. And if you would like to contact me first, please do. There's my email, my cell phone, And over the next couple of months, we need to get this all cleared up and finalized, so we're ready to go for the RA update. So please give me a call. We can help. If you're unfamiliar with how this action plan database works and how you enter projects, we can help with that. And like I said, I will be going through some that I may have questions on that are already in there to make sure that we're clear on exactly what we're talking about with each of these projects.
Yeah, so
That's what I have.
the time is now for all this. We're assembling the update to the reasonable assurance plan. We're going to need this information before summertime. So if you've implemented any projects that have a nutrient load, an estimated nutrient load reduction, if you've stepped up your game for street sweeping, you've done education projects, all these kinds of things, Ray needs this information so that we can incorporate it in that RA plan update. So your help in getting that information is much appreciated, but we do need it before June.
Yes, the sooner the better, because there's always difficulties with making sure everything works exactly right. So the sooner we have it, the sooner we can make sure everything's in there correctly.
And just to add on to what Ray and Maya just said, there's an interest of knowing the completed projects over the current RA period, which is 2017 through 2021, but there's also an interest of projects that of are in the can that are going to be implemented in the future. And I think there's several of those, like septic to sewer conversions, that I've seen some infrastructure funding going towards lately. We would want to know that information as well in this database. So please get that information in there as quickly as possible.
Yes, and thank you in advance.
Do we have any other questions for Ray? So on the septic sewer, there's an incredible amount of funding out there, guys. If y'all aren't looking at it, you need to go after it. In particular, they're really dialed in on septic to sewer. It's pretty easy money. The hard part is actually hitting their timeline. The other thing I would say is our 9 months for those of us that are domestic POTW NPDS dischargers are coming to a close on Senate Bill 64 plan. We probably need to find a talk at some point after June to talk about how we might incorporate those plans into the database that Ray was just discussing, because those will certainly involve additional reductions on various timelines. I think that's probably the more problematic part of that. Is I think a lot of us use 2032 as our deadline, but we actually plan on being done well before 2032, just from a contingency perspective. So for those of you that are POTW discharges that had that plan, think about how you might bring that forward for the future reductions that Ed was talking about. I know that I'd be reluctant to do ours before we get approval from DEP, but once we have approval, I'm ready to discuss how to get that in there and what's reasonable from a timing perspective.
That's a good point. Thanks, Jeff.
All right. With that said, at least the agenda item I think we've all been waiting for, at least me. I'm very excited about it. I think Carol Lopez and Ed are going to present on this integrated ecosystem model, and we'll have hopefully a robust discussion afterwards. Please don't hold back. I know I don't have to tell you that, Chris.
Thank you all. When I talk about the old Tampa Bay integrated ecosystem model, how many of you in the audience are familiar with that model and the work that we did almost a decade ago? If no, you're completely unfamiliar, enter that into the chat, because that gives us an idea of your level of background on some of this foundational work that was done, like I said, almost a decade ago now. So it's a bit of a mix. That's good to see that there is some familiarity in the room. But if you don't recall, we had similar discussions to what we've been basically discussing over the past couple of years, centered around Old Tampa Bay, around the 2011 to 2015 time period. And a lot of this presentation is going to be discussing the tool that was developed from these initial investigations, and that we're now dusting off the shelf and updating to address the current ecology of Old Tampa Bay and how best to move forward with it. So a lot of this is framed around a lot of the old work, just for your guys' background and sort of the initial outcomes of that modeling work that was concluded basically around 2015 and led to different recommendations that we've been pursuing ever since, related to causeway alterations, continued nutrient reductions, and other sort of hydrologic improvements that we have been targeting as an estuary program and as a community. So, you know, the conditions in Old Tampa Bay were fairly similar about a decade ago of what we're experiencing now. We had primarily a lack of seagrass recovery in that Old Tampa Bay segment around the 2011 period compared to the other bay segments. You know, there's not consistent meeting of water quality conditions, especially the chlorophyll A criteria in that bay segment. There's muck accumulation issues in upper Safety Harbor and upper Old Tampa Bay. And of course, we started to see more significant and persistent pyridinium blooms about a decade ago. That led to the estuary program and the district joining forces to develop an approach to further understand what management actions could be implemented to address a lot of these ecosystem perturbations in the Old Tampa Bay segment. And it led to some significant publications, and I'm going to give credit at the end to the host of folks that contributed to the development of this ecosystem model. But I wanted to give reference to the specific tech pubs that you could find and dig into the overall development of the model that was ultimately used. And you know, we didn't develop this in a box. We were using and relying on the Technical Advisory Committee to develop a research framework that called for the need for an integrated ecosystem model because of the complexity that have been discussed in terms of Old Tampa Bay's response to nutrients and the other confounding issues that are affecting its ecology. That need for developing an integrated ecosystem model was recognized by our management community, and that's what led to the further development of the model that I'll be talking about. And also the recognition that up to that point, a lot of hard work and investment was made to ratchet down nutrients. And we knew that there were sort of these major actions that would needed that in synergy to further put that bay segment over the hump in terms of improving water quality conditions to support seagrass growth, the reduction in accumulation of muck in that bay segment, as well as just to improve the general ecology. So on the onset of developing that project, you know, there was some spitballing that occurred in terms of the overall large management actions that could be pursued. And these are grouped here in terms of what was considered relatively fixed costs. So, you know, implementing a specific project that would remove discharges from the bay, or, you know, changing inflow modifications to some of the channelized systems. You know, there was relatively fixed costs that could be assigned, and all these values were spitballed at the beginning of the project, and they were further refined as we developed the Old Tampa Bay integrated model. So you'll see much different total implementation costs based on the 10 management scenarios that were ultimately reviewed in the ecosystem model. But I put this up here just for your information because we're kind of asking the same thing through this round and next iteration of using the model to understand, you know, which specific causeway alterations in tandem with continued nutrient reductions, as well as perhaps additional oyster restoration or shellfish restoration in the bay, could have a potential benefit. And there's both relatively fixed costs dependent on those different management, or there's scale dependent costs depending on the scale of implementation of those different actions. So,
Ed, I'm sorry, can I interrupt real quick?
Yeah.
So these costs that I'm looking at, these are 20. Yeah. Okay. Never mind. I just saw it. $2012.
Yeah, and they were very initial at the start of the project, and you'll see grass at the end. The costs were were developed in a much more realistic fashion in the end. So the cost for the 10 management scenarios that we ultimately investigated ranged from the hundreds of millions to almost $1 billion. So they're not insignificant to implement is the point.
Right.
And that,
Okay.
as we move forward, it sort of needs to be recognized is that there are no low-hanging fruit anymore to address these issues in Old Tampa Bay. There's large actions that are needed, and there's actions that are going to be needed synergistically to happen, both in terms of reducing nutrients as well as the other confounding factors that are affecting continued seagrass recovery in that bay segment. So ultimately, the 10 scenarios that we did investigate in the original Old Tampa Bay integrated model was specific diversions of the Lake Tarpon inflow to Safety Harbor, gross reductions in non-point source loads, not attributing it to any one general area, just reducing them in total by about 25% to the bay segment in total, completely reducing the existing point source discharges to Old Tampa Bay, and then also looking at alterations to the Courtney Campbell Causeway and the Howard Franklin Bridge. So those were ultimately the major management actions that were investigated from a discrete, if we just implemented those, the model was used just to understand what the net ecological benefits would be for those specific actions. But then there's these three scenarios at the end, 8, 9, and 10, that looked at combinations of those different scenarios. And probably the most, we did not look at all possible combinations. If everything was implemented, what the net environmental benefit would be. But there are specific combinations that were addressed, specifically looking at what would happen if we reduced the amount of Lake Tarpon inflow as well as did a causeway alteration on the Howard Franklin Bridge. What happens if we reduce all the point sources and non-point sources? That was scenario 9. So those gave us, I think, some good information on if we invested a lot upfront on some large actions, what the net benefit would be, and further guided, what we were recommending as the outcomes of this modeling work. So as I mentioned, the modeling components that were used relied on pretty much off-the-shelf models that have been developed within the region or have been used, for consistency and other approaches of this nature. So the integrated northern Tampa Bay model was selected as the waterside model for its highly valued use in water supply planning in the region. It was adapted to provide water quality inputs into a hydrodynamic model. ECOM-SED was used for the hydrodynamic modeling component within the bay proper of moving those watershed loads around in the bay. And then the RCA water quality model was ultimately used to see how those watershed inputs and the hydrodynamics ultimately affected nutrient, light attenuation, chlorophyll A, and sediment quality considerations using that RCA model. Ultimately, those model outputs were fed into other ecological models, an optical model developed by Kelly Dixon, and then some work by Mike Welsel to look at environmental favorability functions for specific nectin and benthos to understand what the net benefit might be to the biota. So that is the suite of different modeling components that were used in this integrated Old Tampa Bay ecosystem model. And that's what were fully calibrated and then ultimately used to assess scenarios over specific timescales. And I alluded to it briefly, the way that we distilled, or I should say the modeling group distilled all that information was looking at key ecological attributes, or KEAs, and they're listed here both as outputs from each of the specific modeling components. Those were the specific attributes that were assimilated and judged over a 10-year model window. So the models were developed from the 2000 to 2009 period under baseline conditions, basically calibrating them to the observed data points for each of the model components. And then individually, each of those scenarios were run and compared to those baseline conditions. And the relative change of each of these key ecological attributes and assimilation of those key ecological attributes was termed the net environmental benefit score. So there was a scaled scoring method that was used for each of these attributes relative to whether it was considered a positive or negative change. And after our last discussion with some of Roger's work, interesting to note that we did not consider temperature as one of the key ecological attributes in the original Tampa Bay studies, but that's something that we probably could take a look at with the updated model. So keep that in mind as sort of as I present a more distilled version of what the overall outcomes were for those individual scenarios, and that's what this graph represents for all of Old Tampa Bay. So the net environmental benefit scores are on the y-axis, and the 10 individual scenarios are on the x-axis. And I kind of listed in shorthand what those specific scenarios were, because it's hard to keep in your mind just the numbers 1 through 10. But you know, the end message out of all this work is that, you know, if we continue to reduce significantly the amount of nutrients going into Old Tampa Bay, that probably has the best net environmental benefit for the Old Tampa Bay segment. There are other sort of localized benefits that occurred with, you know, individual diversions from the Lake Tarpon Outfall Canal, or individual diversions with the Lake Tarpon Outfall Canal in combination with alterations of causeways further downstream. But in general, the modeling indicated that, you know, nutrients and the management paradigm that we've been operating under is a good one, and that ultimately that would probably have the best environmental benefit for the Bay segment. And this is across all the key ecological attributes that I just mentioned. It's not just relative to seagrass, it's relative to water quality parameters that were listed in the previous slide, as well as sediment characteristics in terms of potentially reducing muck accumulation in upper Tampa Bay segments, and then also looking at, you know, adequate light conditions for seagrass and overall habitat quality for both specific benthic and fish biota. So it's assimilating a lot of information, but I just wanted to point that out. This is not just specific for you know, the benefit of seagrasses. This is looking at the totality of ecosystem indicators that we were able to assemble using those different modeling components. And if you look more in depth in terms of specific issues, if we look at specific targeted areas, especially where we know we have muck accumulation in upper Old Tampa Bay, particularly in Safety Harbor region, you kind of get a different picture, and that's what this graph is trying to elucidate. So the quadrants in this graph, basically you want to be in this left quadrant. That means that the costs for implementation are low and the net environmental benefits are high. So this upper left-hand corner is basically actions that would have those sort of attributes. And then the lower right quadrant is where we don't want to be. We don't want to be spending a lot of money without a lot of environmental benefit. And as I mentioned, after we took a look at implementation costs for each of these scenarios, the range is and again, this is around mid-2015 values. You know, the cost for implementation of any of those scenarios range from about $176 million to over $1 billion if we looked at combination of implementing these different scenarios. But the long and short of it, again, for the muck accumulation issue is the combined actions of continue to reduce point source and non-point source loads to Old Tampa Bay seem to have the best net environmental benefit. There are other actions and combination of actions that also elicit a fairly high net environmental benefit, but that was sort of the outcome from this specific issue. If we go on to just looking at the time where we had the lack of seagrass recovery and loss, specifically in the Feather Sound region and the upper Old Tampa Bay over by the Town and Country area. So the drainages from Northwest Hillsborough above the Courtney Campbell. Those were specific areas where we're lagging in terms of seagrass recovery. And this is what the modeling indicated would have the most benefits in terms of those issues for those for seagrass losses in those particular areas. So these are distilling a lot of information, like I said, and there are very nuanced sort of outcomes if you looked at the specific outputs. The end message that from all this modeling work was consistent what we've been coming to this group about, and why we continue to rally the Nitrogen Management Consortium is that we continue to stay the course that these combined 9-point and point source reductions would probably provide the greatest overall ecological benefits for Old Tampa Bay. The cost to implement those are fairly significant, we know that. And then these add-on projects, so further reducing inflow from the Lake Tarpon outfall canal, as well as integrating causeway alterations, also have incremental improvements, and oftentimes in combination with these nitrogen load reductions have multiplicative benefits, not necessarily additive. So we know that the complex ecology of Old Tampa Bay is not going to react to one discrete management intervention. It's something that we need to seize the opportunities on and sort of address these things over time as best we can. And as Jeff alluded to, I think the time is right for a lot of these different actions, both on terms of continued point source and non-point source load reductions that we could achieve as a community, but these other big actions that oftentimes aren't necessarily tied to Nitrogen Management Consortium and things that we've been trying to interface with the Florida DOT on in terms of improving circulation or improving hydrologic inputs by working with the Water Management District. So all these ultimately will probably be needed to get Old Tampa Bay back on track given our recent trajectories. And it goes without saying that there's going to be a need for significant investments into all these actions so that we have and can start observing a net environmental benefit across Old Tampa Bay's ecology. So that is a very quick and very high level overview of that initial modeling work. And then I've put this up there is that we're on this now new trajectory in Old Tampa Bay, and it can't go. It goes without stating that we need to take action now. We cannot continue to sort of let these issues linger because we are seeing detrimental effects to the bay's ecology that causes me concern, causes bay managers concerns, but it also gives us that fairly significant warning sign of a trajectory we don't want to be on that we've seen in other Florida estuaries. And everything that's in the news related to those cascading ecological effects like manatee starving is something that we don't want to approach in the Tampa Bay, especially after all the successes and investments that we had. That those significant setbacks are important to keep in mind as we continue to work to implement different scenarios and different management actions in addition to all the ones I just outlined. So that's sort of the work that I'm sort of teeing up and the discussion I'm teeing up. And the last thing I wanted to say before I'll stop, and if you guys had any questions, please let me know. This model was put together by a very robust team of experts, led by Tony Janicki's group, as well as folks that worked individually on each of the modeling components. This was very much an effort not led by the Tampa Bay Estuary Program per se, but one that we were very fortunate to have experts in the region help us assist in developing. We guided sort of the scenario development and how we ultimately assessed each of those scenarios. But all these folks listed on the screen are the ones that put their blood, sweat and tears in developing that initial model. We want to make sure that we're utilizing it effectively moving forward to understand the right mix of actions that are now necessary to get Old Tampa Bay on track. So I'll stop there and ask if you guys had any questions. Again, I know it's probably really, really high level, and I glossed over probably a lot of the outcomes, but there are nuanced sort of results. If you look at the specific scenario, other than the consideration for sea level rise, all of those scenarios generally had a net environmental benefit for the Old Tampa Bay, for Old Tampa Bay's ecology. It's just a matter of how we implement those and what's the right mix of resources to implement those, what's the timing of implementation. All those questions come into play as we move forward to address the Old Tampa Bay issues.
So for the purpose of this discussion, you know, those outcomes are valuable. We have this tool at our disposal. There are certain limitations with the Old Tampa Bay integrated ecosystem model, particularly related to pyridinium, which is the challenge that we're all really trying to address. And so we're trying to update and assemble like updated model components, but also reimagine some of the model scenarios we could run in an updated Old Tampa Bay integrated ecosystem model. And so this was to kind of give you an idea of what that, what that model that we have at our disposal currently looks like, what the components are, and what the prior scenarios that were evaluated were. We're also going to have Carrie share a little bit about, and maybe Sarah too, from FWC, about some of the initial feedback we received from a poster session that we participated in at the BASIS conference, trying to assemble some ideas that we could consider as model scenarios. So we can entertain any questions on this part right now. And then just understand that we're going to start to tease you with some of the ideas that have come out in terms of future scenarios that an updated model could consider. And that's really what we would like to facilitate a discussion on, is building on these, like Ed said, the spitballing of model scenario concepts. So I have a question in the chat from Ryan about where Lake Tarpon water would be diverted to. And then I have Lausanne and then Nan after that. So
Ryan's question, we did not specifically model the Lake Tarpon diversion into the watershed itself. It was basically just removed from the watershed. So that consideration, all that would have to be considered as sort of a nuanced result of that particular scenario.
And historically, Lake Tarpon discharged through a sinkhole, basically, and went out towards Tarpon Springs, I believe, or Dunedin, I guess. I'm not quite sure where it ultimately came back up. So we would, in fact, if we were to pursue that and everybody was on board with that concept, ultimately, not a lot involved other than tearing down the existing cofferdam around that sinkhole on the west side of the lake, and evaluating impacts to some other ecosystem that may not fare very well if all of a sudden that flow gets redirected. I mean, those are the bigger issues I see with the Lake Tarpon. I mean, that is where it used to go. So,
yeah.
Okay, Lausanne.
Hey, this is Lausanne Garcia with Swift Mud. Glad to be in the Nitrogen Management Consortium meeting today, especially seeing one of the projects that I was a part of. Want to give a big shout out to a bunch of people at the district too, who helped review all of those complicated models, and I'm excited that this is being dusted off and being looked at again. And I see in the chat that someone mentioned that Pinellas County is considering ASR for Lake Tarpon. It's my understanding that it is a cooperative funding project. I do know that with the district, and they are in the initial phases. I can't remember how many MGD per day they're looking at trying to divert from the Lake Tarpon outfall canal, but it is something that we are looking at as we develop a swim plan. And I don't know if anybody on the call has more information than I have, but I know that, permitting ASR and injecting water into the ground is usually the biggest issue to resolve. And I believe that those conversations have started. So just wanted to let you all know what I knew about it. And, it will be considered in the swim plan.
Thank you, Lizanne. Nan?
Okay, so my questions are similar to the first one about what happens to the water from Lake Tarpon, but more directed towards the point source and the non-point source. I'm not a scientist, I'm an engineer. I'm trying to think, how do we practically make these things work? So I think we're on track on the non-point source. I'm sorry, the point source, because most of us are going to the zero discharge. But what that means is that we are putting it mostly into reclaimed water that is going to come out in a non-point source. One way or the other, through the groundwater or some way, the water that you put on the ground is going to find its way to Tampa Bay. The other thing, if we're looking at a 25% reduction of our non-point source, how do we make it stop raining? What are we talking about? Just treatment of what makes it into Tampa Bay, or are you talking about quantity? And I think that's the same question with Lake Tarpon outfall. I mean, I can see maybe doing some kind of off-stream treatment or something so that what the water that's getting in there is cleaner water. But what do we do with this volume of water that falls out of the sky routinely? Where do we put it?
Yeah, so I guess, oh, go ahead, Ed.
I was just going to say that, those were discussions that were had during the development of some of these scenarios for sure. And it was definitely seen, especially for a 25% reduction in non-point sources, you're approaching billions of dollars for large regional treatment facilities that we may not even have the space for in the watershed to accommodate. So,
okay, so the discussion
was over a decade ago that these were modeled, so it's relevant to sort of ask these questions again. What can be done in the watershed to improve the Bay's, Old Tampa Bay's ecology? And are these actions still relevant?
So I guess my specific question on those types of alternatives, Lake Tarpon, non-point source, and point source, is it the quantity or the quality that we're, like if we could put pure water, not that anybody wants pure water, but pure water out, would that solve the problem? Or is it the quantity of water in the hydrology that's the problem?
It was both that was simulated. It's basically a reduction of load through 25% reduction in flows to the bay, I believe.
Well, I hate to be the naysayer, but that sounds like an impossibility with our climate.
Well, we're not obligated to use any of those past scenarios. It's more just to give people some ideas. And so, I mean, I think it's really great that folks are having opinions about the feasibility of them. So we're not married to any of that. The whole point is to gin up a new set of scenarios that make sense for the problem that we're trying to tackle now with the people that we have in the room. But we just don't want people to do that in a vacuum without knowing like the history of what's been done before. So, I mean, I feel you and everything you're saying, Nan. That makes total sense to me. We got two more.
I'm sorry, Mike. I think to that point, Howard Franklin was one of the big scenarios in that original evaluation, and I think that ship has sailed based on every time I drive across that bridge recently. So I wish it hadn't, but I think it has. So we got to take that one out and and look for other possibilities. So
there's still a slight opening of the door for Howard Franklin Bridge that we're still under discussions about, but the next opportunity is actually the Gandy Bridge, and that bridge would likely have the least impact for some of the areas where we have water quality issues. But
right, I mean, all you got to look at. Yeah. No, I agree. I personally think every little bit helps. I mean, I think the ASR, or at least the way it was being permitted when I was at DEP for Lake Tarpon, is nominal versus the overall flow. But it, it's about, it's death by 1,000 cuts, and every little bit that we're contributing in this, hydraulically constrained bay segment helps. And it's just about that. It's about chipping away, Nan, chipping away at this overall problem. So
I think some later work that we put together sort of gives that indications, not only these infrastructure improvement projects from both point source and non-point source loading considerations, but the overall restoration of the bay, cumulatively, those actions add up and they don't operate in a vacuum. So one discrete project, is influenced by implementation of other projects in a particular bay segment. And we know we need to continue to do that to reverse the trend, the current trend that we're on.
Ilya has a question about the source of data for the cost of eliminating point sources.
Yeah, that was mainly through, I think I saw Dave on there. I think Dave, when he was working as a consultant, as well as some of the other consultants that worked on the project, interfaced with each of the municipalities to come up with rough costs for removal of either like point sources entirely from the bay and what that scaled cost could be. There's a whole appendix. As I mentioned, I provided some links to the Old Tampa Bay Integrated Model project. But there's a whole appendix in the Task 5 report that outlines how those costs were developed for each of the scenarios.
So Ed, that's on that. You provided that link.
Yeah, is early on in I think it's TB Tech Report number 11-15. That'll take you to all the modeling products, and it's specifically the Task 5 report, one of the appendices that have the cost for each of those scenarios.
And those were I think I heard that was 2015 numbers.
Yeah, it was about that time that monetary information was put together.
Okay.
I think the course costs were in 2012 dollars.
2020. Okay. All right, I'll look into that. Thank you.
And I could follow up with a link, a direct link for you too.
That would be great. Thanks.
So I think Dave also had a question that what they're seeing in the Indian River Lagoon, especially the upper Indian River Lagoon, is co-limitation of TP values. And
yeah, Ed, I had kind of like, and I apologize, I missed it earlier, but I kind of thought, like, as I'm looking through some of the reports, that there's this downward trend in nitrogen, but there's not a downward trend in chlorophyll. And I'm kind of wondering if, what the phosphorus is doing. I don't know. And I do know that that's a question that they're asking the upper part of the lagoon, is whether or not in areas with a fairly high, not unsubstantial amount of carbonate materials, whether or not phosphorus has become more important. And that's kind of tied into the other issue, which is, you're losing seagrass, but the chlorophyll is not really changing. Is that also perhaps associated with the fact that, our light studies were done 20 years ago, and, the bay is now deeper. And, down in Sarasota, we're 6 inches deeper than we were 20 years ago. Is it possible that you're losing seagrass because the water clarity is not changing that much, but it's now having to go through? So really two things, phosphorus, does it trend with the lack of trend of chlorophyll? And do you think that potentially what you might have going on is the effect of sea level rise in an area where it was always marginal amount of light that's now going through 6 inches more water column?
yeah, I don't think there's been any significant or differing trends for TP. I think the primary TP trends that I've revisited in the past was it's overwhelmed by the large reductions that occurred from like in the 1980s. But I'd have to take a look at more of the recent TP trends, particularly in Old Tampa Bay, if there's any deviations throughout what we're seeing in terms of TN and crude delay.
Hi, Ed.
Yeah, go ahead.
I looked a little bit about the ambient concentrations on nutrients when I put this paper together. And if we look at that data from the EPC database, it shows that the bay has become increasingly nitrogen limited, pretty much due to increased phosphorus levels.
More phosphorus saturation because of the nitrogen reductions that have taken place. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, I looked at the last 10 years, so I was surprised to see that. I looked at that because that's what they also found in Indian River Lagoon.
And that's kind of like, that's where it gets a little tricky, because I think their first impression was that, you know, it would become more nitrogen limited because of that. But if your phosphorus is increasing, your nitrogen's going down, chlorophyll's not changing, maybe the phosphorus has some role in what you're seeing. But I know that's one of the first things you see is, oh, phosphorus is increasing, so it's driving a more to nitrogen limitation by ratios alone. But maybe it's worthwhile having, you know, Roger repeat the work that you did in Hillsborough Bay back in the 80s of actually doing manipulative studies and verifying.
That would be a good idea.
Hey, I'd have full trust in Roger more than anyone, more than myself, to figure this out.
I can't, maybe Adam, I think Adam Wood's on the call. We looked at it for both Palm River and the Port Red Wing outfall, and we did not see that trend, or at least it was still being overwhelmed by the nitrogen.
Yeah, I didn't mean to mention that. I didn't mention that. I did not see any trends in the discharges into the bay, but this was within the bay sampling that I saw these patterns.
But yeah, well, yeah, Roger, what I was referencing, and I'm not sure if Adam's still on here, he did the work for us. We evaluated whether a phosphorus exemption for those two outfalls was appropriate, and at least in Hillsborough Bay, we still found that the ratio was so overwhelming that it was. It didn't really change what our effluent water quality was. It just changed whether it was a criteria for us. So we're still well below 1 part phosphorus, but we did pursue the exemption in accordance with the statute, and it was a slam dunk. It wasn't even close. That was probably 4 years ago. But Old Tampa Bay is different. It's not truly in Bone Valley. It could be experiencing something different, particularly coupled with some of the other factors Dave mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the possibility, you know, is that a deeper system with more anoxia could be creating conditions where phosphorus isn't bound with the sediments as much as it used to be, and therefore you could have no change in the phosphorus load, but have more phosphorus in the water column. And again, I have no idea, but you know, I think Roger would be a good person, in my opinion, to look into this in a little bit greater detail, because I think ratios only take you so far. And the old manipulative types of experiments that, you know, really nailed it for nitrogen, I think might be something worth looking at.
Yeah, I had the same thoughts, Dave, about the phosphorus becoming more available for the water column.
You'd have to rename your committee, though, to Nutrient Management Consortium.
Cross that bridge when we get to it.
Don't start, Dave, please.
No pun intended.
Stay down there in Sarasota, Dave.
So I wanted to give Carrie and Sarah a chance to summarize some of the initial feedback we heard at basis about some of the potential scenarios we might consider in an updated Old Tampa Bay model. So
thanks, Maya. Thanks, Ed. I think that was a great overview you gave of the integrated model and how it was used for developing scenarios. And it was helpful for me to see that. And so at the basis meeting, like Maya said, we had these posters where we were essentially asking for feedback on helping to develop either conceptual or planned management scenarios, particularly as they relate to shellfish restoration or hydrologic restoration. And so this is, this is one of two of those posters. This is showing the one for shellfish restoration, and we had provided an opportunity for people to comment by post-it notes or virtually. And so what we're looking at here is essentially those orange squares are the post-it notes that people posted. We took photos and they're on the last slide, but so what I wanted to do is quickly summarize the feedback. And, if you were at this meeting or you made some of these comments, please feel free to elaborate on them. And then hopefully we can have more discussion about these potential scenarios. So for shellfish restoration, suggestions were living shorelines along the causeways and including a living shoreline in Oyster Bay, and then supplementing natural oyster reefs like in Booth Point. A comment also mentioned floating solar panels with oysters hanging off floating structures at a large scale. Someone mentioned treating Lake Tarpon watershed. And then under the research questions that came up, this is one that has come up at every discussion that we've had regarding this, and that's that we need estimates of how large shellfish projects need to be to make a significant reduction in bloom. So that keeps being brought up. Another concern that has come up is the impact of saxitoxins on oyster health and potential concerns for the food web. These, oysters would not be for human consumption, but what are the food web impacts in the bay? Someone also said to look into clams, and we originally had some experiments with clams in one of our shellfish grazing pyridinium projects. And the reason we hadn't pursued clams is because of the lower salinities in the summer, which would not be as optimal for clams, but other people may want to comment on that. And I think that essentially summarizes the feedback on this particular slide. Maya, do you want to discuss this before we go on to the hydrology?
yeah, I think we can do that. So one of the management tools, in addition to nutrient reduction that we've been discussing through the Old Tampa Bay Working Group and this actionable science grant, is the shellfish restoration opportunities. So if you all had suggestions for additional projects that we should consider in developing a management scenario or research questions, that we could be putting into a phase 2 grant proposal to begin to resolve those questions so that you would feel more comfortable implementing these kinds of projects to improve water quality conditions in Old Tampa Bay, this would be the time for you to share, those kind of ideas so that, like I said, we can build a new set of scenarios that make sense for the challenges that we're facing today in 2022.
I think I
Maya.
see
Go ahead, Luzon.
Thank you. I wasn't at basis, so is the thought that the shellfish would filter out the pyridinium? Or would it be that they would reduce the nutrients that were available to the pyridinium? Or is it both?
Primarily, I'll let Carrie answer.
I was going to say, which probably was what Maya was going to say, primarily filter out the pyridinium, so actually consuming them. contributing to their, you know, their loss from the water column.
So all of the work that we've done collaborating with Carrie and FWC, you know, prior to this grant proposal and the work now has indicated that even if we do all the good things, that we're still needing to accelerate factors that are addressing cellular loss for pyridinium. And so, you know, shellfish consuming them before they're able to produce these resting cysts and fuel future blooms is one of the things that we're hoping to address by using shellfish restoration aquaculture as one of the tools to improve this bay segment.
Thank you.
Just to note, you know, Tom put in the chat his continued concern about, you know, the defecation of those shellfish and what that would mean in terms of nutrient recycling for their feces and pseudofeces. So that's probably a question that would need to be addressed in further research of whether or not that is actually reducing the availability of nutrients and or reducing the number of viable cysts, as I think your early experiments kind of indicated that there are still viable cysts from this tube.
I guess I still have in my mind like a concept like what Lost Coast Oysters does down in Joe Bay area, where we're talking about, you know, the plastic cages full of oysters where we could rotate them in and out. And maybe that's not coming through as clear here as the suggestion. Because we have like more permanent installations of oyster reefs, and that could be part of it, but we could also be implementing more temporary approaches with like floating oyster bags that we could rotate in and out as needed. So partnering with like aquaculture operations.
I have a question about that. Based on something you said earlier, is that the shellfish would not be harvestable. So where's the benefit to an aquaculture operation coming in and doing something like this? I'm not understanding that.
I can't answer the second part of your question, but I would say that because they would have toxins that, you know, that they would not be harvestable. And I think that would involve other agencies like FDEX. And but I don't know about as far as, you know, what would be the incentive for aquaculture. I'm not sure. Maya, do you?
I think there's different ways you could view aquaculture for restoration purposes too. And just because they have them in one location doesn't mean they can't move them to another location. They could you know, reduce the amount of burden of some of these toxins in other locations over time, and then ultimately they might be sellable at that point. So a lot of those, I think, are research questions that need to address. If those resources were used for human consumption, those considerations would have to be met by the operators in the aquaculture facility. But I would be hesitant to take something like that off the table because of, you know, that concern. Because there's ways that we potentially could manage around that.
And I'm not suggesting that. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the concept and fundability and some of those long-term things.
Well, I think there's a few operators here in our region that are, you know, altruism is part of, you know, the reason that they're doing the work that they are. So, you know, I think if you purchased materials from them, like, I don't know, like there wouldn't have to be like a resale kind of market aspect that's going on. So yes, it would cost money to do the install, but you know, beyond that, I don't know that that's what they're trying to do. And then I know that there have been other entities who are looking to generate oysters like on land-based facilities. and they want to generate lots of rootstock that then could be, applied in these kinds of contexts, whether it's for an installed reef or not. And so again, it's the same thing. You pay for the material, but there wouldn't be like an expectation of recouping costs somewhere else. So there's just an industry of people that are interested in this kind of thing. And then I know that UF and Sea Grant have been looking into, some of programs that are similar to what they've done, like in the Chesapeake, where you can monetize the potential nutrient load reduction from this kind of thing. That's not the path that we've been on here in Tampa Bay. And like Carrie and I mentioned at the beginning, we're not as interested in it as like a nutrient reduction strategy as much as we are as like increasing cellular loss for pyridinium. So I don't know if that work is relevant or not, but I do think that there are other incentives for folks to participate in those kinds of activities. So for whatever that's worth.
I see a comment from Dave about essentially, I guess, modeling the, oyster grazing, and it's more complicated than just taking the, clearance rates and expanding that. And I think that, right now, that's essentially, we have, those calculations, those simple calculations. And I think one of the next steps would be to have a more, I'm not a shellfish person, but, have a more complicated model of oyster grazing, like they've done in other locations, but where we can, come up with some better estimates than the simple calculations that we can do right now.
Yeah, one of the things we're recommending for people who are, because we're all in favor of more filter feeders in Sarasota Bay. There's nothing wrong with that at all. We pay for it, we're going to pay for it in the future. But we want realistic expectations of what they can do. And what we've kind of recommended would be like something between like the aquarium study, where you put a couple of oysters in a 20-gallon aquarium and it clears up over the course of a presentation, and the Shellfish Research Institute study that was done with 600,000 clams, it didn't find a benefit. And we kind of think that something in between would make a lot of sense, like a 20,000-gallon mesocosm study in the bay. Can you show evidence of like, clearing the water of the organisms that we think can happen in a more realistic than an aquarium type of study? But we're kind of recommending something like that in Sarasota Bay, and Moat is doing a few things like that. But we've got the same thing with like under dock reefs. We're asking people, well, let's test it, let's see what they can do actually, in a controlled environment out in the field. But aquarium studies are too small, models are too simplistic. Something that kind of real world can show, hey, I had 20,000 gallons and it cleared the pyridinium out with a density of this. That could get people excited.
Yeah, and can I expand on that, Dave? One of my things too is, when you're talking about filtering organisms, whether it's plants or animals, then for me, I'm wondering, what do you do with the filter once it's clogged? Are you removing that biomass and destroying those oysters somewhere, landfill them or whatever, or do you take them to a clean tank and let them purge? I'm not sure how you deal with what you've theoretically removed in a sustainable way.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean, that's a real good point.
I think, just from the sense of our habitat master plan, we have a goal of 50 more acres of oyster habitat throughout the bay by over the next year. Just in terms of the ecosystem benefits of having more, like Dave put it, filter feeders in the bay is important to us. How that, again, synergistically helps with with other water quality issues is sort of the question mark. But we do recognize that increasing the balance of those habitats in the bay is important. And we decided as a management community that for those goals to happen.
Roger, do you want to unmute and talk about what we should put in the chat? And then we'll probably move on to the next slide. Go ahead, Gary.
Okay, I could just address, I see his comment about reduced opportunity for sexual reproduction of pyridinium cells could be accomplished by reducing populations, by limiting nutrient availability and increased disbursement. I think, any strategies that reduce the opportunity for sexual reproduction of cells, is going to benefit in the long run, because I mean that's the thought anyway, because you're essentially decreasing this reseeding of the seed beds, which is seeding the future blooms. There's a lot of cysts, so that would be like a long-term probably strategy, would be my perspective. But I think anything we do that's reducing the opportunity for a lot of cells to make a lot of cysts is going to improve things down the road, I think, in terms of pyridinium. Do you want me to go on to the?
Yeah, so the second
you've already switched it.
the second big strategy that we've been trying to add, which we've been talking about in this group for a while, is different types of hydrologic restoration projects, whether that means modifications to causeways or changes to these flood control structures that are delivering and changing the timing and delivery of fresh water to this bay segment. So we're looking for ideas that could address these kinds of concerns, big and small, that we could wrap up into a model scenario. So I'll let Carrie summarize the feedback we've received thus far and then open it up to you all to share projects that you might be aware of or things that you think.
Yeah, and this is similar to what we were discussing earlier. I think, two things keep coming, two options keep coming up, and one is the causeways and, how to potentially create more flow at the causeways, and then Lake Tarpon. And this comment was to shift the floodgates to pull from the top water rather than the bottom. Questions. Someone else had commented up in the upper right on, which seemed to be more of an approach, I think, to getting community support for this. I didn't. It's hard to to interpret Post-it notes sometimes without actually talking to the person who posted them. So if anyone that's here wants to elaborate on that.
This is David Moore's plan for Old Tampa Bay. It's a 6-step plan. It's really great to hear him say it in person.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know. But yeah, again, Lake Tarpon and the causeways are the major two that surface here. And yeah, maybe we can talk more about that. What's feasible.
Yeah, and the first thing that I don't see on here is there's a lot more tidal tributaries, little tidal creeks, and flood control structures beyond just Lake Tarpon. There's other big ones, channels A and G, but then there's also a whole series of Mullet Creek, Alligator Creek, Channel 5, Roosevelt. There's a number of these waterways that are delivering fresh water to this bay segment, and there are projects that are occurring on some of those creeks, and there are opportunities on some other ones that I would look to, you all as the partners and the implementers of those things to share with us.
Well, I mean, I agree about the channel A and channel A structure. The channel G structure actually goes through Rocky Creek, and was Sweetwater Creek and still is at some places. And then you actually have a permanent structure on channel A / Rocky Creek and around Linebaugh that holds water back all the time, no matter what. So I'm not sure about those two structures, Maya. There's nothing on Double Branch that I'm aware of. There's a whole bunch on Feather Sound area that Largo comes through. And I'm not sure whether holding some of that water back ends up being a net positive. It's not like that water wasn't coming there to begin with. And I think particularly in Northwest, the Double Branch and the large portions of the Rocky Creek watershed, you do have modern stormwater attachments. That's not necessarily saying they're great, but they're not antiquated. They're not pre-stormwater rule stuff. So it's worth looking at for sure. I think the volumes of those discharges pale in comparison to Lake Tarpon. Lake Tarpon is just orders of magnitude different in total volume, I believe. So I think they're all worth looking at. Like I said before, is every little bit counts kind of thing.
And what would the actions be related to those? Would those be just changing the flow, or are we talking treatment? Like what are the actions that people are thinking of?
Well, at the Rocky Creek and Channel A gates, we worked to get, back when I was at DEP, to get the Water Management District to open them. We've seen better health in those portions of that watershed as a result. But I'm not saying that hasn't resulted in more impacts to that portion of Old Tampa Bay above the causeway. We never looked at that when we were looking at it, when Charles Kovich and I were looking at that. But we've definitely seen major changes in Channel A. It's recruiting mangroves all the way up the waters now, as an example.
I think, Carrie, what we've discussed for some of these systems is the concepts of urban stream restoration, creating more meanders, snags, opportunities for habitats to persist along some of the channel banks. That's what, from the estuary program's perspective, we would encourage. What that gets translated to ultimately in terms of a restoration or flood conveyance project isn't always one-to-one with sort of that vision. So I think it's going to be placed by each tributary is going to be different from that sense.
I definitely agree with that, Ed. And I think one thing that I can tell you in my, watching the Channel A Rocky Creek interaction is if we could isolate Channel A for, probably the 80 or 90 percentile depths that typically flow down that, what we see in Channel A now often is we see flow up Rocky Creek and down Channel A from tidal response. And that's because Channel A, like you said, is just one big open wide ditch, and it the tide goes up and it's like, what's the path of least resistance to get back out? And when Adam and I have looked at that, we're not convinced that that's a super healthy situation for those two watersheds.
So like rather than modeling a 100% diversion of Lake Tarpon or from one of these flood control structures, like what we would be trying to capture then is like what happens if you took like a certain percentage of that flow offline, like from the straight delivery line that it's on right now, you ran it through like a treatment wetland with some sinews, you slowed it down, you removed some nutrients and sediments and stuff along the way. But then ultimately you're going to reintroduce that flow back. So how do we model like what that would look like as a strategy and what the benefit for that kind of project might be? So I think to like some of Nan's points about like the feasibility or reality of, you know, some of the scenarios that were modeled the last time we did this, like what would a more feasible potential look like, and then what would the benefit be? So that'd be like one of my thoughts about what that might look like. Gerald, you have some comments in the chat. Do you want to unmute and share them with the group?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Maya. Yeah, I was just, getting back to the question I asked earlier about the hydrologically adjusted loads. I may be misremembering this stuff because it's been a while since I've looked at it, but I was thinking that, is it the case that the actual TN load to Old Tampa Bay really hasn't gone down since the bad old days of the late 70s and early 80s, unlike most other bay segments. But what has happened, I think, if I remember correctly, in Old Tampa Bay is that the freshwater loads have been going up. And so that's sort of, it makes it look like when you look at hydrologically adjusted TN load, it looks like that's improving. But I'm thinking that maybe the actual mass load of nitrogen going into Old Tampa Bay is about the same now. It may even be a little bit higher than it was in the late 70s and early 80s. And if that is the case, then maybe that would be something interesting to look at with the model. Would be, what does the model say Old Tampa Bay would look like under a scenario where the TN load really hasn't gone down, but you've got more fresh water, you've got higher temperatures, you've got sea level rise, all those other things happening. That might be an interesting combination of things to ask the model to give a prediction on, what does it think Old Tampa Bay would look like under that combination of factors.
Well, Gerald, I don't think any bay segment met the TN loads originally. That's why we went with the hydrologic normalization.
Well, no, but my point, Jeff, was that other bay segments, the actual mass load of nitrogen has declined since the bad old days. But if I'm remembering correctly from looking at the data a couple of years ago, that wasn't the case for Old Tampa Bay. The total mass load is actually flat, over all those decades. And if that's the case, then that, to me, that's kind of interesting.
Here, Ed's pulling it up.
You guys see it?
We keep talking about how well we've done all these nitrogen load reductions, but I'm not sure we have done nitrogen load reductions for Old Tampa Bay. It seems like it's kind of in the same situation it was in decades ago in terms of the actual TN mass load.
So the top graph is the total nitrogen load in Old Tampa Bay over time from 1985 to current, and then the bottom one is the hydrologically normalized. So to Gerald's point, we've been basically bouncing around the total nitrogen load consistent with what was occurring back in the 1980s and through the 1990s.
Yeah, I'm sort of wondering if, we may have seen some improvements in water quality in Old Tampa Bay because water quality improved in Hillsborough Bay and Middle Tampa Bay, and that some of that water gets circulated up into OTB, and so things can look better for a while. But if you aren't really reducing the inload to OTB, I wonder if we've kind of not getting that benefit is it's sort of gone away now, and we're not getting any benefit of reduced inloads from the watershed of Old Tampa Bay to that bay segment. Just stuff I've been wondering about.
Well, there seems to be a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that this increase in rainfall that we've seen over the last decade has resulted in a more widespread and persistent bloom of pyridinium, which would make sense intuitively, But I think to your point, when you look at the hydrologically adjusted TN loads, that doesn't necessarily explain that connection exists.
Yeah, I guess one thing I'm wondering is whether the hydrologic adjustment is actually sort of is fooling us to some extent, and that what we maybe need to be looking at in as well as the hydrologically adjusted load is the actual TN load and how
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, Gerald. I'm glad you brought that up because I think you articulated it much better than I could have. But I'm thinking the same thing you are.
I mean, one of the things I've thought, Gerald, in looking at some of the Noreen Corps' work, is that our traffic volumes crossing the bay and sitting on the causeway and the Howard Franklin are not being adequately captured from a TN loading perspective, and that the TN load, while we represent it one way, is actually going up. Because when you look at her work, and that's been what, 12 years? That was 12 plus years ago. I can tell you what day of the week it is once you make that correlation. I certainly can tell you when it was Saturday and Sunday. It is a huge deposition, and we don't capture that. Once we lost that air monitoring location, that correlation, it's lost from that far northwest of our now present air monitoring location.
That's a really great point, Jeff.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess that is a great point, Jeff. And I guess the only reason for me blabbing on was just to encourage the group to don't look just at the hydrologically adjusted loads, but let's keep our eye on the actual mass load of nitrogen. And if we aren't being effective at reducing that mass load, that may be something that we need to focus more on. So that was the only thing I was trying to say.
Well, I think you're right, Gerald, for sure. I just really think we've lost our direct deposition, particularly for that bay segment. We don't experience that kind of direct deposition in any other bay segment. And we have no way to really know at this point. Those cars sit there and dump TN into the, knocks into the water all the time.
Yeah. And Roger just put an interesting note in the chat about that the organic end load may be something that we need to be paying attention to for pyridinium. And yeah, I mean, there's some evidence in the literature that it's able to it's not just uptaking inorganic in, it can also take up what the fertilizer component, urea. Well, there are a lot of sources of urea, but it may be tapping into the organic in pool, so it's a whole different kind of a beast than we maybe have been looking at in the existing model. So the model may need to be modified to be able to look at that also.
Yeah,
Okay.
It seems like there's a bigger theme here, which is that we can't afford to expect that the how we've managed the rest of the bay successfully over these decades is appropriately working in Old Tampa Bay. And Gerald's point, hydrologically corrected nutrient loads, that may be exactly the right way to do the rest of the bay, but it may be because of long residence time, you need to go back to looking at nutrient loads. The fact that the nitrogen load, not hydrologically modified, is not changing, maybe it's not a surprise that the water quality is not where we want it to be.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That's been my concern for a while.
So it's after 12 now, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time. It's going to continue to be nitrogen management and all these other strategies kind of discussion. And so we are working on this actionable science grant, and that's sort of what's driving some of these discussions. And our goal is to update the Old Tampa Bay integrated ecosystem model identify what limitations need to be addressed in that model, develop a new suite of scenarios to address the chlorophyll A conditions in Old Tampa Bay. So if you do have any ideas for projects, particularly related to these two additional strategies of hydrologic restoration or shellfish restoration, we would be very interested in hearing more about what those ideas are, whether they're projects that are planned or just concepts for projects or anything, any kind of feedback that you have related to that, because that's the information we're going to use to develop these scenarios. And our goal is to develop scenarios that are feasible, plausible, and will help you evaluate whether or not to move forward with which projects to really help Old Tampa Bay. So I'd like to let everybody go with that, but if you do have that kind of feedback to provide, you know, shoot us an email. You can email Ed, me, Carrie, any of us will share with each other in the project team, and we'll work to keep these conversations going. Anything else?
Next date for particularly the Old Tampa Bay working group? Do you want to try to get a date on the calendar?
Well, the first question is, we know we need to meet again for Old Tampa Bay just to keep the, you know, the momentum going. We're probably shooting for sometime in June. If we want to meet in person, if you give me a couple of dates to shoot for us, see when the Regional Planning Council is available. If you guys want to continue meeting virtually, then I think we could select a date now. So what's the will of the group in terms of in-person or virtual? So I see one request for in-person.
I would prefer in person.
Maya, this is Alana. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can check on our council chambers availability now if you guys do decide to do it in person.
So it's been put forward that week of June 6th. I know that there's the Silver Jackets for those involved in resilient stuff on the 7th. So I would ask not the 7th, but we could do the 8th or the 10th, maybe.
ABM is on the 9th, it looks like.
That's why I said the 8th or the 10th.
There's a FRICA meeting that's happening all day on the 10th. We have nothing on the 7th.
Well, 7th is that resilience technical workshop for the Silver Jackets. I don't know if you've been a part of that, but that won't work for me.
The 8th out?
8th is my preference, if that's available, Alana.
In the morning, it looks like there's some kind of a police standards council that's happening until 11.
So would you guys be willing to do the afternoon of the 8th?
I'm sorry, Maya, which month are we looking at?
June. So if we did like 1:30 to 3:30, would that work for people?
I have a conflict that afternoon.
So Ilya, you said you have a conflict. Is it all afternoon, or if we did like over lunch, would that work for people?
I'm not available 1 to 3.
Oh.
The 2nd looks like it's wide open if you wanted another date.
The 2nd, Alana? Is that what you said?
Yes, June 2nd, the Thursday.
That works for me. Is this for all Tampa Bay or?
Yeah, the idea is that this would be an Old Tampa Bay working group meeting.
Yeah. Yes, I would like to be part of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the second in the morning, 9:30 to noon.
That's fine.
Okay.
In person, it sounds like, right?
Yep, in person. I will probably be able to run it as a hybrid meeting, but I will just like warn everybody in advance that the audio is not fabulous for a hybrid meeting. So if you really want a good experience, I would encourage you to attend in person, but we'll do our best to provide at least like an opportunity to listen.
Hey, and not for nothing, but just for clarification, there's no, since this is a subcommittee and a work group, there's no requirement to meet in person and vote on things, is there?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
I think that was the last order.